They're confronted with grieving task 1, and I'm in grieving task 3. This is a little bit of a problem, because what's in grieving task 1? Denial. That's how you cope with task 1, because you can't do it all at once. It's impossible. So you've got to have some denial, and your family members immediately start bargaining. They immediately start saying, well, isn't there a way that this might not be as big a loss as I feel like it might be? Because it's terrifying for them too, right? It's not just you who live with threats of social exclusion. They may have never experienced those threats until that very moment, and all of a sudden, wham, I'm not going to have my family forever. That's an incredibly potent, powerful, difficult moment. And the hardest thing then is that their identity is tied up with the identity of the religion. So they've been trained to look at you as the source of the problem, and nobody wants to blame themselves. And since they're kind of, the self is mixed up with the system, it's easy to look outward at someone else. Now, you tell someone and then you're thrown back into phase 1. This loss is harder than I thought. So you end up in denial, and you end up in bargaining, and you want to convince them, and you want to see if isn't there some way to change it. Can't I make you leave the church with me? Can't I make you see my point of view? And the biggest problem that happens here with grief and loss issues is that what each of you need to heal is contradictory to what's going to be helpful to the other person. Each of you need a chance to have some denial. Each of you need a chance to do some bargaining. Each of you are going to need a chance to be angry, but you know what? It's going to hurt each other if you point it at each other. You're going through the exact same thing on opposite sides. So that's just the last point. You get together with someone you love, and the things that you need could be harmful to each other. Another piece of grief and loss is that this is an ambiguous loss, right? There's no, well, here we have a beautiful thing, which is this is a social support ritual for dealing with this loss. So to the people who founded this, Sue and Kath and Steve and everybody helping make this happen, thank you. This is incredibly important to have a conference like this, because it's incredibly important to have social support systems. It's incredibly important to have a moment where everybody can get together, and if you haven't tried alcohol, here's a supportive group of people who are going to help you into this new world. Because there's this ambiguity to it. There's not, someone dies and everyone comes over and there's a funeral. There's a whole structure to dealing with that loss, and there's no structure to dealing with this loss. So for those people building that structure, thank you. The other thing is it can be difficult or taboo to discuss. This thing happens to your family members too, right? Like, who do they call to say, guess what? My spouse doesn't believe anymore. It's getting a little better because it's happening a lot and people are having to talk about it, but that's a big deal. Like, you may not have anyone to talk to. Lack of clear, accurate information about the loss. This is a huge problem, especially for your family members and friends in the church. They don't have very good information about this loss. They have very poor information about this loss in general. And then there's a lack of clear indicators of closure, which make it difficult to proceed. So for instance, with your family members, how do they know this is never going to change? That's really hard. I have a little slide on resignation, but it's one of the reasons I think resignation is a useful tool, because it is a very clear indication of closure. I think family members understand they resigned and they don't believe, and I can't ask them to get rebaptized because that wouldn't work. And so it helps with that closure piece sometimes. And it's painful for everybody, but it can provide a sense of closure both for yourself and for family and friends who are not, that kind of sets a final boundary that is difficult to come back across. Now, the last piece of unconscious stuff that might be going on is, I wouldn't pay too much attention to this slide. It's got heavy scientific sounding quotes. Predictive coding. So I'm going to just bounce on to the next one to explain it. Basically what that says is our brains tend to kind of look out at a situation predict what it's going to be, and then notice the details. So in a very real sense, you perceive the forest before you perceive the trees. Maybe the best example is I'm driving through the forest around Lake Tahoe, and my brother-in-law says to me, "Look at that." And I look at a tree, and I'm not very interested. And he says, "No, wait, really, look at it." So I really look at it, and it's not a tree. It's a cell phone tower. Pretty obviously a cell phone tower disguised as a tree. But because my brain expects a forest, I don't notice it, not one lick. Now, if you set that out in my front yard, I'm never, ever going to think it's a tree. So how does this work for this? You're likely to miss important details. Our brains have some predictive coding. We have been acculturated to think that we're going to be rejected. We have a whole system of training that's been installed to think that we're going to be rejected. We've dealt with trying to avoid rejection our entire life, and now we're confronting that, and your brain is going to automatically filter out things that don't match that perception unless they rise to a significant level. Now, it's a little bit much to expect that your family or friends will know that the shy smile or the pat on the back or the small little thing that they're doing is not going to be noticed, and to expect them to greatly exaggerate everything they're doing that's at all accepting of you. That you could ask them to. It's not a bad idea. But it's a little difficult. Now, in terms of healing, this is also a problem. Self-fulfilling prophecies. There's some interesting research that shows that things you're afraid of are more likely to happen to you. It's just because your brain, this is the predictive coding effect. You're seeing how it might happen. You're seeing that, and you're more likely to fall into that pattern. So when I first really began confronting that I needed to maybe step out of this system of the Mormon church, I was in a small town working as a counselor, and one of the really frustrating things I saw was like either in some of these small towns, pretty much either you were an active Mormon or you were an alcoholic. And I really wondered about that. That seems so strange to me. I thought, now, I think it speaks to the abuse, like you gotta cope somehow. But I think it also speaks to the fact that this was the expectation. And it can be very difficult to buck that expectation. And it's one of the things to watch for yourself as you go through this. How much impact are these unconscious predictive things? How are they impacting you? What if you have a misfortune and there's still that underlying thing that says that misfortune is because you misbehaved? So watch out for that as you're healing. There are some cross-boundary myths that make talking to family hard. So the idea that faith transition is due to laziness or transgression, that can be really difficult to deal with because that's what they're going to see. And from the flip side, believing that people can't be accepting. I will tell you, I work with a lot of couples who are on opposite sides. And one of the things that surprises me is when I get a couple in and the person who's left cannot at all see how accepting their spouse who is staying inside is. I've met some really beautiful people who have been, it's been a very healing experience for me because I'm dealing with my own predictive coding that says I will be rejected, and I get to see these. It's not my own situation, so I'm not getting triggered, and I've spent a long time trying to clear myself enough to deal with it, and I'm seeing these people who are being remarkably accepting, who are just, and sometimes the other family member cannot see it at all. So watch out for that. I wanted to talk really briefly in this context about commonly misread emotional cues. So I tell my spouse that I don't think I believe in the church anymore. I might want to leave. And immediately, they're very anxious. Obviously, with good reason. Now, anxiety doesn't look on the face that different from rejection. Right? And I'm expecting rejection. That's what I'm worried about. And so what I see is this person's rejecting me, and what they're experiencing is So that's an interesting one. The other one is my feeling of being judged. Does not look, what my facial expressions when I feel judged are not very different from the facial expressions that I experience when I feel shame. So I'm upset about being judged, and I maybe am avoiding eye contact. I'm maybe being defensive. And if I felt ashamed, I might also react in very similar ways. So these are things that it's important to talk about because they can be misperceived. So we're going to move on to some tools for healing all of these things. And that's the heading, so let's just jump right in. I wanted to offer another Mary Oliver quote. She's my favorite poet. Here's the quote. "You do not have to be good." It's the first line of a poem called Wild Geese. What I want to tell you is that if you're thinking, I have to do this right, I have to exit the church right, I have to deal with my family right, that is the Mormon inside of you. I'm telling that person, you do not have to be good. You have to be who you are. That's how come you're here instead of there, is because you have to be who you are. So just don't worry about it. And the real truth is, you might be having a really difficult time. You might have gone through something horrific and be really struggling. So you can't really expect yourself to do something perfect. So the first step is accept where and how you are. Don't try and change things you can't. Don't try and imagine that, oh, you know, that whole worthiness training thing, I have so perfectly dealt with that, it never comes up for me, it never bothers me, because it's just probably going to come up. That's probably just going to happen. Your reactions, some of them are hardwired. You can retrain some of them, but some of them are just going to pop up for you. 20 years from now, you might discover. So, next thing is, you're dealing with loss. It's hard. And you're probably going to be angry. And anger is okay, because anger is your friend. Now, we might talk a little bit about how to utilize anger in a healthy way versus a destructive way. But if you need to be a little destructive, that's okay. All right, last thing, are you dealing with trauma? You might want to pay some attention to that, because not everyone has the same level of trauma. Not everyone experiences the same level of abuse inside the system. And those who experience abuse don't always experience it as traumatically as others. It's just a differential thing, different for each person. So the first thing we want to do is measure and observe. Just start to notice what's going on for yourself. Begin to watch your emotions. Begin to watch your reactions. I notice people, I'm going to interject here, take all the pictures you want, and I will also post this. So if anybody wants the whole thing later to review it, or your picture turned out blurry, or you just want me not in the picture, all of that's okay. Develop a good emotional vocabulary, because that can be helpful. You want to be as articulate about your inner world as possible. I recommend using an emotion thermometer, a scale of 1 to 10 to measure emotions. 1 is like, this is great, I can handle it, the emotion's not bothering me. 10, well here, I'll flip to the next slide. 10 is call 911. You want to pay attention to what triggers these very strong emotional reactions. And you want to measure how fast your reactions climb this emotional scale. Like, do you suddenly rocket from a 3 to a 7? That you want to know what things do that to you. I'm going to point out most people begin to lose control around 7 to 9. So you got at 7, you got, oh my gosh. And you can see it only gets worse from there. About the moment you get past, oh my gosh, pretty much your skill level is gone, because you've entered a fight or flight reaction. So you're no longer in rational control of what you're doing, probably, if your emotions are that high. Your brain evolved this as a way to escape polar bears, and it works very well for that. It doesn't always work really well with your family member, and we're going to talk about how to make it work a little better with them, because the problem is you might need to kill the polar bear, or you might need to never see the polar bear again in some way, shape, or form. Or you might need to lie very still while it kind of tears you apart a little. None of those are a good idea with family. So the last thing you want to pay attention to, whether or not you think you have trauma, is what triggers you. What triggers these strong emotional reactions? So here are a few things that might. And there's a whole list of others that I'm sure you could add. But worthiness, unworthiness cues, I find all the time. This is a huge trigger for people. I'm going to put facial expressions there. Does anyone know the bishop stare? They're like, I'm assessing your worthiness stare. Oh. I had somebody try that on me right in the midst of my whole thing. I almost kicked him. You know, it was just like, I couldn't believe I went from, I'm so glad to see you, to I want to kill you. Like, oh! And I was a little astonished, you know, because I'm a counselor, and I worked through it. It's why I'm a pacifist, because I think, you know, I don't need any practice at wanting, nobody really needs any practice at wanting to kill people. That's kind of built in, right? So, rituals can be difficult. Words or phrases can also be difficult. Symbols, decorations. I talk to so many people who tell me, I felt fine, and then I walked in the house, and there was the temple, and there was the quote from so-and-so, and there was the picture of a poor person being abused who has dementia, but they're making him work and give talks at conference. And this maybe is a moment to mention it. So yesterday something said something about Elder Anderson's talk that included Give Joseph Smith a Break, and I thought, that sounds interesting. I didn't pay attention to conference at all. I thought, I better Google this. So I start typing in Elder, what is his name, Anderson? And I get the A, and Google shows the suggested search, elder abuse. I was like, I think that's the general authority I'm met with. So, anyway, there we have that. Now, the next thing you might want to think of is volume knobs. Everyone's used, or anymore, we've got volume sliders. But some of you look old enough, you might remember knobs. If you've got a predictive coding error, which is, I'm going to go talk to my family member and my brain thinks they're going to reject me, you need to, number one, say, any rejection I experience, I need to mentally try and turn that down. I need to try and mentally adjust, okay, it felt like a 10, I'm just going to knock it down 3 notches to a 7. I can maybe deal with the 7. Now, this doesn't necessarily solve your internal emotion, but practicing this can be very helpful. The other thing is you need to turn up the knob. You need to go, I am looking for any cue that I'm accepted, and I'm going to turn that way up. Now, you can ask your family members to work with you on this. You can say, hey, I don't notice when you show me that you care about me. And if you would point it out or exaggerate it a little bit, that might be helpful for me. And I'm going to try and do the same. And you might have this conversation in reverse works really well too, because your family member might be having the same problem. Now, I think that covers that. Setting boundaries. You're going to need to set some boundaries, because part of healing, part of the problem is you had no boundaries. You were in an abusive system that stole your boundaries. And you have to set some boundaries. You have to claim the space that you need for you to grow. You have to tear up what's on top of you and set it aside. So here's just some real tips for setting boundaries. Describe your situation. That's really helpful for your family member to say, when this happens, so when you ask me to pray, when I go to church, or when you say, express your emotion. Here's what I'm feeling. Set the boundary. I don't want to feel that way, so here's how I want to do it instead. Now, here's a consideration that you don't find in most boundary setting things, but I'm going to mention it to you. Avoid triggering their worthiness training. This is very important, because setting a boundary, we want to especially avoid. So one of the things to try and do is just own this yourself. You may need to blame the church. Go find a friend that you can rant to on the phone after you set. Or go to coffee with somebody. I feel better. I thought I felt the spirit again. So let them know unconditional love is incredibly important. Let them know you don't have to do anything for me. I'm going to take care of myself. And I'm doing that because I need to, because I'm worried about how I'll behave if I'm so upset. And I don't want to hurt you. And it's fine. I usually say, don't steal their hope. Say, hey, I hope it's not this hard in the future. I hope maybe I hope someday I could come sit in church with you for a few minutes and not be all freaked out and make enemies of everybody and be passive aggressive for 2 weeks afterwards. And avoid long discussions if emotions are high. So if you're above a 7, you want to just gracefully exit. If you're at a 7 and you think it might go up because you've been watching your triggers and that's part of the reason for paying attention is how long can I stay in a manageable place and when can't I? When you know that, then you can just gracefully try and get out right before it happens. Say, hey, this is bad, I don't want to hurt you, I don't want to feel upset, and I need a break. Is there a clock somewhere? Shut me up if I go too long. Appropriate distancing, I should have put versus avoidance. Now, avoidance can get to be a problem, right? But appropriate distancing is something you'll have to work on. So we've already mostly talked about this, but the key piece here is notice what you can't deal with skillfully, and don't try and tackle that. Now, I started running a while back because I was getting fat, and I thought it might be nice to be outside. And I trained and eventually ran a half marathon and didn't quite die. Now, I couldn't have run a full marathon. That just wasn't a possibility at that time. And this is what you need to pay attention to for yourself. What are you trained for at this point? What can you handle emotionally? Where are you at? Don't try and tackle something you can't handle. If you can't handle it, get out of the situation. And then you can sit down and strategize for, I want to handle this. It's okay to train for a marathon. Don't run a marathon untrained. That's this. Now, if you are in public settings, I find for people who need to go somewhere with a believing family member, this is important. You may need to go with them. You may want to go with them. You may feel like, I want this to work. Have a couple of escape plans ready. So cell phones are wonderful this way. You can suddenly receive a text that you didn't receive. Remember, you don't have to be good, which means to the public, I would suggest that you let your family member know if they're close to you that you're handling things this way so they don't wonder what horrible thing happened that you had to run out for. But you can just get called away. There's no reason you can't, and you don't owe anyone an explanation, and you could just not feel well. You could just, if you're somewhere and it's not working out, you could just have an emergency and leave. And you don't need to tell people why. Now, reclaiming ownership of self. This is important work that we all have to do. Now, I put the read in parentheses. I read all this recovering from cult literature, and it all talks about, reclaiming the self. And I'm like, I did not really get a chance to claim myself in the first place. So I'm not sure there's any read about this. It's sort of like, I left the church and I'm like, why do I feel like I'm a teenager again? So you need to begin exploring what you want in all the following areas. Your body. How many people here had a weird adult first-time experience of underwear shopping? You probably need someone to talk to about it too, because it's a weird thing, and there are not many people who can understand this. So I suggest we develop a social ritual of helping people with their first time out. But you got to figure out what you want. You didn't get to choose your underwear. That's how invasive this is, right? Nobody can see it, but it's still important. Except you can all see it, and I'm going to make sure. Anyway. Here's some things you might be exploring. Hairstyles, colors. I was like, I'm so grateful I got out before I went bald. I always wanted long hair. I got a chance. You may need to experiment with all of these things to just sort of see you didn't maybe get a chance to do this. And sexuality, incredibly important because there's so much repression around that and so much abuse about that in the church. One thing I'm going to mention that I didn't get to earlier that I think is incredibly important, and it's one of the things that really clued me into there being a problem when I was first going through training as a counselor. I was just reading statistics, and this particular statistics I was reading was talking about consequences of sexual abuse as a child for females. And I was reading through this and discovered that it said in teenage years, approximately 50% of females who have been sexually abused end up with many sexual relationships. And that was part of them processing the experience. And I suddenly realized that stigmatizing sex was re-abusing people who'd been abused. This just infuriated me, because now all these poor people are going into their bishop trying to talk about it. Instead of processing that they were abused, they get abused by an authority who makes them feel ashamed of healing. And that's one of the biggest problems of Mormonism, is so often people end up feeling ashamed of healing. So sexuality, same thing happens obviously with individuals who have an orientation other than Mormon trademarked perfect family forever, second wives only in the hereafter. To be looked forward to by all the narcissists. Time, resources, hobbies, interests, self-care, your mind and your soul, ideas, movies, music, books, education, spirituality if you want it, no spirituality if you don't want it. And one thing I didn't mention here that I think is important is speech. So I had to learn to tolerate the distress of swearing in public. So, I mean, that's kind of a tricky thing. It's silly. I was extremely repressed. I grew up with a terrible, debilitating anxiety disorder called Mormonism. So resigning from membership, I wanted to put this out there. It's a powerful way of exploring ownership of yourself. You don't have to resign. Obviously, everyone needs their own path. But I did find, when I went through my experience, occasionally people would ask me, well, why did you resign instead of letting them excommunicate you? And the real reason for me was that I needed to claim ownership of that process. I needed at that point for me to be the one making the decision, not for somebody else to be deciding it. Now, if there had been a powerful benefit that I thought I could have handled in a PR sort of way to managing that as an activist, that might have been fine. And people choose that all the time. And some people need the experience of different ways of handling it, of staying in, of being excommunicated. There's nothing wrong with it, but I did want to mention, I thought, we owe a debt to the people who sued the church to make it so we could resign. I wanted to go back here and just talk briefly about being aware of exploring yourself. Well, no, I'm going to go through. Dealing with shame. So shame can interfere. As you're exploring yourself, you've got to watch for shame. And so let's talk about shame. If you're feeling any shame, start with a logical analysis of whether the issue you feel shame about is harming anyone. Check this out with trusted friends. Don't vet it against where you got the shame from. Check it out with somebody. Now, if it is harming someone, you're not feeling shame. You're feeling regret. Just fix it. Just deal with it and fix it. If it's not harming anyone, you're probably dealing with shame. Here's a great quote about shame. Shame is the result of an abusive system successfully projecting its guilt onto the individuals being abused. I use this one. This is where I think anger is helpful. When I feel shame, I go to this idea and it makes me angry. It makes me angry that I am feeling ashamed because somebody else did something to me. That anger can really help you deal with the shame. So anger is an incredibly important tool because you've got to fight this shame. Here's how you fight shame. Go find the thing that makes you feel ashamed and do it over and over and over again until it goes away. So, I'll give you a brief example from my own life. I've been out of the church for a while, and the president gets on TV, and not the president of the church, the president of the U.S. And he says, I think some people are so scared of me that they wouldn't even want to have a beer with me. And I thought, I'm not scared of you, I'm scared of the beer. I'm not sure I could do that. What if the president calls and he wants to have a beer? And I'm like, the whole time I'm like, oh my gosh, can I drink this beer? What's going to happen? How do I have